So as Brian said earlier, we have some diversity here today. We have Californians. Come on in, have a seat. Some Oregon hospitality. Who did that whistle? Who's ruder than me? Thank you, guys. So we're going to have three ladies from Northern California talk to you next. To give an example, they're laughing at ladies? Three young women from Northern California. Talk to us about the approaches they're taking down there, and I really love what they've pulled together because it's going to definitely show the cooperation that's going on between Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service down there, which I think is kind of the core of what we're trying to get to with all of this stuff. So Jan Johnson is going to talk first with Fish and Wildlife Service. She's in the Wairika office. Then Christine Jordan from the Mount Shasta McLeod on the Shasta T, right? Yeah. And then Catherine Fitzgerald, who's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also in Wairika. So they're going to do a tag team of three. So help me welcome all of them, please. Thank you.
California's here, woohoo! The young ladies from California, I love that. Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much, Cheryl, for including us in this workshop, because often we feel like we're the stepchild of the Northwest Forest Plan because we're down on the south end, and so much issue is going on up here, and sometimes it just doesn't seem like it's getting the focus as much in Northern California. So but we're doing things, we're accomplishing things, and really appreciate the opportunity to share what we're doing. And we're going to take a tag team approach at this. I'm going to be summarizing three Klamath National Forest projects that are in various stages of implementation across the forest, and summarize those. It's going to be I'm going to go really fast through some of the main points of how we address critical habitat, what the ecological conditions of those landscapes are, what the objectives were, how we applied the best available science to those in developing the treatments, what the effects to the PCEs were, the degree of Fish and Wildlife Service involvement in those actions, and then some of the challenges that were met for those projects in planning and implementations, and then finally some of the successes that are coming out through that. And so Christine and Catherine are going to go into a little bit more detail for one of the projects on the Shasta Trinity. So they're going to have the second half of this half-hour block. Just to give folks a sense of time set, these three projects were developed stemming from the late successional reserve assessments that the forest had developed. So these are LSR-based restoration-focused projects. So they'll take a different shift and approach to it than would a matrix or general forest type of critical habitat treatment. Mount Ashland was one of the first ones down the pike. Analysis for that was initiated in 2006. It considered the 1992 critical habitat designation. Concurrence was met for it. The consultation was completed in 2007, but it went through the reinitiation process because it wasn't quite fully implemented. The Singleton and Johnny O'Neill projects were a little bit later down the road. They incorporated the 2008 critical habitat rule, but by the time consultation came to the table, the 2012 rule had been proposed. So our consultation incorporated the critical habitat rule that was proposed at that time. So they're in various phases of implementation. Mount Ashland is about 2/3 of the way done, and it's on their last year of their contract, so they're not sure if it's going to be, as far as the commercial component, they don't know if they're going to be able to finish it. Singleton just got started last year, and Johnny O'Neill hasn't yet initiated the action yet. They're just still marking. It's almost done with the marking. These projects were kind of developed thinking outside of the box in the way that the Forest Service elected to integrate the Fish and Wildlife Service. Mount Ashland, they had this flush of money come from the region to implement LSR treatments, and so they had this block of money, but not enough wildlife biologists to participate in the analysis. So Mount Ashland worked with an agreement with the Wairika office and brought on David Johnson, no relation, to be the acting biologist, the project biologist for the NEPA analysis. And the same thing with Johnny O'Neill, except I was the project biologist for that and also the co-team lead. So that was an experience I wouldn't recommend to anybody being a project biologist and a NEPA team lead, because I have so much respect for you guys in the Forest Service and all of the analyses that you have to do for MIS and sensitive species and survey and manage. It just is crazy making. So, and then Singleton was more of a classic streamlined consultation process. The Fish and Wildlife Service biologist was very involved with the development of the prescriptions and worked very closely with the fuels planner and the silviculturist and the biologist. So that really met the spirit of streamlined consultation, because we had very active role in the planning of that. The projects, these are all located in the California Klamath Province. So as you guys know, this is a very rugged landscape. It's composed of a high diversity of vegetation, several stages, soil types, and a lot of the fire there is influenced by the slope and aspect, and the fire patterns are reflective of that. This is typically, the Klamath Province is a frequent low to moderate intensity fire regime, and so you just see this landscape as being a very complex mix of things. Except, as you all know, fire suppression has taken a pretty heavy toll on the vegetation complexity over the last 100 years, and these projects are reflective of that. They're all have had very few fires in the last century to create that mosaic of stand conditions that would have historically occurred. So Mount Ashland is right on the California-Oregon border, just on the south side. It's not part of that Mount Ashland Resiliency project. It's just to the south side of that same LSR. It's mixed conifer component with mixed conifer dominated with very little hardwood component there. The habitat is influenced by the historic railroad logging that happened in the early 1900s, the fire suppression, and checkerboard ownership. Generally, the stands that they have selected for treatments contain very low structural diversity. There was very little late successional habitat in this particular LSR. It was isolated and scattered in small patches. So the stands that they selected for treatment represented very dense, homogeneous, somewhat sterile stands. The Singleton LSR was a little bit further to the south and west of that, kind of really in the center of the Klamath National Forest. It's entirely composed of a checkerboard landscape. So the LSR itself is, the continuity and connectivity of habitats is very limited. But it represents a very high diversity of vegetation. Despite that, there's a high degree of soil type variation, fire frequency within it, and past management. It's been hit pretty hard by management in the past, in the early 60s and through the early 70s. But the checkerboard ownership is all industrial forest management, and so it's been hit pretty hard. And consequently, there's a concern about some of the fuel loads in that private within the LSR and on the private lands. The Johnny O'Neill project is in an LSR that is very different from those first two. It's dominated by late successional habitats, but within it, there are a lot of stands that have developed under fire suppression, and there's very little structural diversity. But still, there's these late successional elements that are incredibly important that we really wanted to focus on. Such as these hardwoods there. That was like a, 47-inch black oak. And then this is a 9.7-inch Douglas fir right along Horse Creek drainage proper. And then this lower left image is also reflective of some of the treatment units that we really wanted to focus on, because you can see it's a condition that owls cannot fly through. It's just too dense, and there's no diversity. There's no multi-story complex structure. So that was one of the target type of treatment areas. So again, these were driven by LSR assessments, and for the projects that were focusing on early stand treatments, early seral stands and mid-seral stands was developing later successional habitat and enhancing the connectivity while reducing the threat of high severity fire. I mean, this is, this purpose and need, you hear this over and over and over again, but this is what the forest is really trying to get at. They also really wanted to protect the early and mid-seral habitats because that's going to represent future conditions for owls for recovery. I mean, we really wanted to do that. So you all know how once a fire hits a dense plantation or a dense early seral thing, it kind of cranks up a notch and it tends to not stick around too much. So then, let's see, increasing the stand resilience, individual stand resilience, that was an objective, especially with the Johnny O'Neill, is we had these great big giant trees, even mid-successional black oaks that were just kind of, growing as much as they can into the canopy. They were just completely engulfed by and overtopped by the second growth Doug fir. So we really wanted to radially thin around them, clear around them, create some openings to enhance the reproduction of the black oak component. So these were all within critical habitat almost entirely, or dominated by critical habitat. So the treatments consisted, all of them, a mix of commercial and non-commercial only, and prescribed fire. And then one of the projects had a roadside fuel reduction element, and the other one had a focused treatment on the ridges and upper slope positions. So they were also very much focused on the lower quality habitats. So again, those ridges, I'll get into the ecology in a little bit, but it was all of these focused on treating lower quality habitats for spotted owls, treating around the high value habitats. They all employed variable density thinning, where you had mosaics of treated and untreated stands. This particular Johnny O I can speak to had a 15% of untreated by treatment unit, 15% of a heavily thinned, and then the rest of it being variably thinned. And our anchor points in marking was going into the stand and looking for the biggest element and then working from that. So the prescriptions focused on reducing the fuel continuity, retaining all large trees. The forest elected in all these cases to employ a 20-inch diameter limit, and I know there's issues that are associated with that. But that's just the avenue they chose to do. They all prescribed fire, and they were all designed to retain the function of habitat that was being treated. That, along with the variability within and between stands in these treatment units, all of these things combined kind of led us to the determination that they were a may affect, not likely to adversely affect. Because also, another thing that led to that, this can be a really tricky thing with determinations, is, the amount of treatment versus the degree of change in the stand that's expected. Because there was so much variability, because we had so much involvement from the get-go with these projects, we had a higher comfort level, and we felt like we could support a not likely determination. So just an idea on, these are the reinitiation numbers just on acres treated and kind of how they were distributed in the PCEs. So you can see with these projects, there's very little treatment in PCE2, the nesting roosting habitat, much more so in PCE3, which was foraging habitat. A lot of it was low quality foraging just because of the condition of the stands. I personally probably overrepresented some of the habitat there because I just couldn't say that it wouldn't be used by foraging owls. Dennis Rock in the audience knows a lot more stand by stand by stand where owls are foraging, but Nikazi's data on owl use in forested landscapes really kind of helped inform us with this because, at that time we didn't really have any a whole lot of data on actual stand use by foraging, so that informed us a lot. Mount Ashland in particular, you can see, really focused on the dispersal habitat treatments. So treatments and effects to critical habitat, we really tried to incorporate a lot of Taylor and Skinner's work that they did in informing us what historical stand conditions were in that landscape. When fires burn through the Klamath Province, they burn hotter on the upper ridges, more frequently on the upper ridges and on south-facing slopes, whereas not so much on the lower end of the slopes and on north-facing slopes. And you heard that from Bruce. I think Bruce spoke to that. The intent was to reduce the densities of the shade-tolerant species and increase the basal area of hardwoods. And the effects to the critical habitat for us really, we evaluated the degree of change that really helped inform us on and support our determination for a not likely. And we evaluated those on the change to habitat function compared to the owl use, the expected owl use and life history. So the challenges in planning, there's a lot of similarity between these projects, mainly because of the influence of checkerboard ownerships. There's very high road densities in these landscapes, and so any kind of ground-based logging or riparian treatments brought concerns by resources and the public, as did the temporary road proposals. So there was a lot of give and take about, dropping temp roads if it wasn't really going to show that it was going to be meaningful if those particular stands that they wanted to treat, if they had to put a road in there. So there was a lot of back and forth with that. There was a high level of between stand variability, so they had to develop and spend more time developing stand-specific prescriptions rather than a one-size-fits-all prescription across the landscape. Balancing objectives with feasibility. Again, this is a really rugged terrain, and having this great idea and thinking you can do it sometimes doesn't always work out once the logging systems folks come into the conversation. And that's one recommendation I would have for folks coming into projects, if you don't already do that, is get those guys in there, because they bring a dose of reality to the discussion, in my experience. And one of the challenges for me with this particular project I worked on was the civiculturist and fuels planner were teams folks, and they were stationed in Idaho and Montana. And I just was very impaired by that, because there's so many effective and constructive discussions that happen on the ground in the field with those two resources. They're the key to getting these projects implemented. And so I was kind of hindered by that. Implementation challenges. Mount Ashland, which is the one that's really being hit on the ground. Now, these are all stewardship actions, by the way. This had a marking crew that was contracted, and that was a little bit problematic because they hadn't worked in that landscape before, and they hadn't used these kind of messy silviculture prescriptions. I call them messy, but they're really kind of creative, and you got to kind of think outside the box. And that was a little bit of a struggle, but the way they got around that was the biologist and silviculture worked with the marking crew at the very beginning, got them to really understand where they were coming from, did periodic check-ins, and did some remarking and all of that. But once they invested that time at the beginning, it really proved to carry through to the end from that perspective. Stewardship process is new for the forest to this scale of projects, so there's been some learning from the forest on that end. Distance of the mill, the Johnny O'Neill project is in the middle of the forest, and it's really far from any commercial mill source, and so this is going to be a very expensive project. For the amount of volume they're going to get out of it, we're paying for it. This is what restoration costs. The terrain in that landscape does not necessarily facilitate chip trucks, so there's going to be some expense with that in transferring the material from one landing to another. And then prescribed fire. Both of these projects all employ 1,500 to 2,000 acres of prescribed fire, so you guys know it takes a long time to implement with the windows that they have and the qualified burn boss staffing that's available. So the successes, no litigation. These were HFRA projects, so two of them had objections that were filed, but they were able to work through that and resolve that. The areas are being treated now. We're hitting the ground and employing restoration forestry, which is somewhat new on the Klamath National Forest. So that's a big step forward. We're learning a lot. It's forcing us to be familiar with the science and applying that appropriately. It's resulted in some really positive working relationships between the forest and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we all recognize that we have a shared interest in doing post-implementation, not monitoring, but review, and kind of validating our assumptions that were made. Is this retaining suitable foraging habitat? Really? What went wrong? And if we can recognize that and identify it and learn from it and apply it to the next one, then I call that a success. So that's my 15 minutes. I'm going to hand it over to Christine and Catherine, and they'll finish up.
Different down arrow, right, okay. So we're going to talk about just one project, the Elk Lake Successional Reserve Enhancement Project, which is on the Shasta McCloud Management Unit of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. And so before we get into the project specifics, though, it's in the East Cascade South Critical Habitat Unit. And so this critical habitat unit is flatter than other parts of the range. It was, because of the flatness, it was easily railroad logged in the past, and fire suppression is pretty effective because firefighters can get where they need to go to fight that fire. So that's a little different than some other of the local critical habitat areas. It also has a dry climate with a low to mixed severity frequent fire regime, and that was before the advent of fire suppression, but it hasn't burned in a while. Pine is more dominant here than in some other parts of the northern spotted owl range, and the pure ponderosa pine stands that you find here, or also pine with a small diameter white fir understory, they don't make very good northern spotted owl habitat. So the spotted owl habitat is fragmented in this landscape. Also, the species composition has been altered due to the fire suppression and past logging, and so there's a lot more white fir, which is a very sensitive species to fire. It's not resilient to fire. And a lot less Douglas fir, sugar pine, ponderosa pine, and oak than there was historically. Another thing is that aside from the habitat being sparsely distributed, the federal land is kind of sparsely distributed in this part of the world. So in the critical habitat rule, especially for ECS3, which is the furthest south of those three different colors of critical habitat subunits that you can see on there, it was designated in addition to demographic support for north to south connectivity, specifically in an area of sparse spotted owl habitat and sparse federal land. So just to orient you a little bit to that map, the blue circle at the top is Crater Lake. The gray line that you can just barely see, that's the Oregon-California border. The white circle is Mount Shasta. And that little orange thing there is, oh, that got moved around at some point. That little box is supposed to be on that orange thing. And that's the elk project area. So to zoom in a little bit more, only a portion of it is actually in critical habitat, and it's that northwestern portion that you may be able to see is shaded. And you can see in this elk project area, you can see that fragmented habitat. You probably can't see on this map, but it's also, there's a lot of private land surrounding the project area. So the elk project area is representative of the conditions described for the ECS subunit. And this is just an overview. You can see some of the issues. They're pretty visible. So it includes some really homogeneous, overcrowded pine plantations, and here's a really hideous example of one. There's also some decent owl habitat, although northern spotted owls don't seem to be using it very consistently in recent years, more for an occasional owl coming through. There are some really large old-growth trees that somehow escaped railroad logging. I measured a couple myself that were greater than 80-inch in diameter. And there are also some large mature trees that aren't old growth. They're in that 80 to 100-year-old age range. But they managed to grow greater than 30 inches in that time period because of good growing conditions in the stand that they're growing in. But in other parts of the project, there is overstocking and really crowded conditions in stands leading to disease, including anosis in white fir, black stain and pine, and also western pine beetle. And so there are these growing mortality patches in parts of the project. Obviously, some of the stands have already just completely collapsed, and there are other places that seem to be on their way. So I'll let Christine take it from there to talk about the purpose and need.
Thank you, Catherine. So Catherine really did a great job of setting the stage for the landscape position of elk within the East Cascades South Critical Habitat subunit. And as you could see from several of the introductory slides, that we have a lot of things going on. This project area is about 3,400 acres. It's surrounded to the north and west by private lands and is composed of approximately 25% older plantations, 10% younger plantations, 10% meadow, and the rest are natural stands. Those stands are composed of a mix of ponderosa pine on the lower slope elevations, grading up into white fir, incense cedar, sugar pine, Douglas fir, black oak, and that's where we have our critical habitat designated, which is about 20% of the project area. So our main purpose and need stems from our forest's late successional reserve assessment, which is to reduce the current and future risk of a large-scale disturbance within early, mid, and late successional habitat. Well, a portion of that has already occurred, and what we're moving toward now is trying to, or what we have done is developed the project and its design to basically treat the whole project area and move it toward the condition that we would like to see. So these are just some other representative stand conditions. Key objectives were reducing the risk of late successional habitat loss because of stand density, the drought, disease, root disease impacts that we're seeing, fire-related mortality. The preliminary fire modeling shows that in the 90th percentile weather conditions, we would see about a 40% mid to high severity fire within just the natural stands. And when you have, a pretty low amount of that to begin with, that's a significant loss. Maintaining, protecting, enhancing vegetation characteristics for late successional dependent species, like the northern spotted owl, but also the northern goshawk, the Pacific fisher, American martin. Those are our sensitive species. And then reducing root disease spread with treatments, being consistent with the, sorry about that. It's a little weird on here, so I apologize. I'm reading and you're not seeing it. Being consistent with the northern spotted owl recovery plan objectives, and then reducing the potential for that extreme fire behavior on those directly adjacent private lands and within the wildland urban interface. So how we kind of started planning the treatments in elk, and I'm going to kind of shift to just talking about the critical habitat since that's the focus of this workshop today, was prioritization in NSO habitat and critical habitat, taking into consideration the recovery plan. We started planning the project really heavily, and Catherine will go over our consultation timeline in a few minutes, but prior to the 2012 critical habitat rule. But we knew it was coming, and we had the recovery plan in hand, and so we could be out on the ground kind of prioritizing treatment areas and non-treatment areas, doing that ground truthing of the NSO core, home range, and critical habitat areas. So we excluded the high quality habitat, both PCE 2 and 3, nesting, roosting, foraging, from mechanical thinning. it will receive a low-intensity underburn. And then we prioritize those natural stands that have that low to moderate quality foraging habitat that an owl just couldn't fly through. They're dense, homogeneous, no structural diversity, as well as our lower quality dispersal and capable habitat that's in some of our older plantations. And so our strategic treatments that we developed within those areas, the PCE 2 and 3, those high quality, we have underburning proposed. We've developed very specific limits of acceptable mortality for our coarse woody debris, our range of tree size classes, and have prescribed cooler season burns. To meet those objectives, we will be using kind of an adaptive management strategy as well to implement, one in one place and see if it's really meeting our objectives, and then modify if not. And then facilitating individual tree growth, health, and resilience in both pine and the mixed conifer areas for PCE 3 and 4. And just using those variable density thinning treatments, having a lower basal area in the pine-dominated areas versus a higher in the mixed conifer areas, radial thinning of our legacy pine components so we can hold on to that, gap creation in those dense white fir stands, and then group selection in these older plantations to get some more species diversity and break up the continuity in there as well so we don't see additional black stain root disease or anosis in the pine. And then we've also have a few of those struggling black oaks and aspen, and so we developed treatments for those for releasing around 30 feet of the drip line just to the south aspects. And then project design features of maintaining all Douglas fir, incense cedar, and sugar pine that are greater than 24 inches in diameter. And so some additional design features, these are across the project, not just in critical habitat, but to retain all predominant trees, because that's your structure and what you're wanting to hold on to in these late successional stands. Retaining Douglas fir, cedar, white fir, sugar pine that we find kind of growing in clumps. That provides really high quality thermal refugia as well as prey base rest sites for other late successional species, not just owls. And then we specified rates, as available, 4 to 6 small, dense clumps per acre, and then maybe 3 larger clumps per acre if they're available. And that would be about 1/10 of an acre size would be a larger clump. And then consistent with our LSR assessment, retaining 10 to 15% of our natural stands that are proposed for thinning and plantations, in a unthinned condition. They would still receive potential for underburn, but there would be no direct ignition in there. And those unthinned patches retain those larger trees, snags, smaller trees, and coarse wood. And then additional measures are we just retaining Douglas fir, sugar pine, and incense cedar snags. We don't have a diameter limit, for thinning, and we don't have, like some of the other Northwest Forest Plan forests, a diameter limit for snags in our LSRs. So we have to sort of develop project by project some of these measures to maintain those habitat elements, and then always taking safety into consideration as well. And then the last kind of key project design features that we've modified the species preference when implementing those variable density thinning treatments versus the rest of the project area. So we'll be selecting for ponderosa pine to retain that kind of in the southeast, east portion, and then in the critical habitat core home range area, selecting for sugar pine, Douglas fir, incense cedar, and then ponderosa pine. And all of that was actually made possible because we had great integration with the Fish and Wildlife Office, and Catherine can talk about that.
So one thing I want to point out, somebody said something earlier about the impetus for this whole workshop being that there's been a lot of turnover in staff working on spotted owls, and we've had that too. And we've actually had that within this timeline that you see here. So every little shape that you see on that timeline is some field visit, meeting, maybe a level 1 meeting or a public meeting, or some significant exchange of information, like, somebody mapped, one of the habitat models in the action area and sent a PDF of it to the Forest Service or something like that. So that's what all of those symbols mean, and you can see that there are a lot of them over a period of time. Back in the murky time before the end of 2011, this project was actually being consulted on between a teams group on the Forest Service and a different Fish and Wildlife Service office, and for various historical reasons that I won't go into, it switched to being mostly the district, although I think there's still at least one teams person involved.
Yes.
And then our Fish and Wildlife office in Wairika, but even the staff member within Wairika who's been associated with this project has changed over time. I haven't been that person the whole time. But we've had such good coordination. When Christine became involved, she's really kept the whole level 1 team aware of what's going on here. That it's been easy to just slip into that role and to understand, what the point of the project is, why certain areas have been prioritized, why certain prescriptions are the way they are. And so she's continued those check-ins, and we're getting to the point now where we're getting ready to start the formal consultation process, right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh.
Nope. Let's fly. So the science used, I covered a little bit of this, and I have to apologize, I stole this right out of the General Technical Report 220, but basically increasing resilience in dry forests. There's a lot of literature about this in the NSO recovery plan, but maintaining those large trees, creating gaps in homogeneous stands, radial thinning around our large pine, and influencing fire behavior. And since one of the key objectives of the project is to get that historic fire return interval back, we feel that this is a good approach. And we consider that the best available science because if you don't use the best available science...
So I don't want to dwell on this, please don't read all the words, but I just want to point out that we're in a situation, probably many of you are in the same situation, where we have very polarized elements in the public. We have environmental groups that like to sue us, and they like to say, you're being arbitrary and capricious, you're not using the best available science. And they sue each project that comes out. The timber industry doesn't really sue project by project, but they always, they want the forest to get the cutout, and they will do things like sue the entire critical habitat process and say, you're being arbitrary and capricious because you didn't use the best available science. So the only strategy to deal with that is to really use the best available science, to apply it as best you possibly can, and then when you go to court, your project will be defensible.
So some of the planning challenges, working with team members to vary their thinning treatments. It was very, against the norm of historic treatments that were done. There was kind of a one-size-fits-all. If we're in pine, we're going to thin to this. If we're, even if pine is a minor component, if there's a pine there, we're thinning the whole stand 80 to 100 basal area. And then modifying fuels treatments to achieve those long-term objectives. There was kind of the misconception that all ladder fuels are bad, or all understory trees are bad because they're ladder fuels, sorry. But those can, depending on where they're located on the landscape in your project area, they provide habitat. And so working with our silviculturist and fuels planner was a little bit of a challenge, but I think we're all on the same page now. And then we have those high levels of within stand and between stand variability, which leads to very site-specific stand prescriptions. And so balancing that along with all of our numerous objectives and getting to that treatment feasibility. So we're going to have very specific marking guides. Those have already, we've already started developing those and seeing how this actually plays out during the implementation phase. Some planning successes were integration of the recovery plan from the start. I think that is key when you're planning any kind of project that's going to influence owl habitat, is that everyone on the ID team is on the same page. And we're at the draft analysis stage. Everyone understands what we're doing and why. Integration of the Fish and Wildlife Service at the IDT level. working on the ground with them, so we know where each, resource group is coming from. And then frequent and effective communication. I don't know how many times I've asked Catherine, are you sure we're consistent with RA 32, by burning in here? Balancing that landscape approach, considering the private lands, late successional reserve, critical habitat, our environmental community. And then monitoring those results from recent projects so that we can apply lessons learned there, as well as, incorporating this adaptive management strategy. I'm going to just skip that one. So just to jump to the effects to critical habitat, since we've determined that our treatments are going to retain those important components of PCE 2, 3, and 4 in the short term as well as over the long term, those large old trees, snags, species composition, increased vertical and horizontal structure, we're still going to have short-term adverse effects to PCEs. Because we're going to have those continuous treatments across the landscape. They're going to be compounded. There's not one part of this project area or the critical habitat that won't see some form of treatment. So while they've all been designed to retain habitat function, we're going to have those impacts to foraging habitat and prey.
So we're thinking there might be some short-term adverse effects, but the idea of this project is really to have the long-term benefit to really kind of fix some of the problems that have built up due to the railroad logging and the fire suppression, to create a more resilient forest over the long term, and to really get back some of that diversity, increase the diversity that's there, and both in terms of species diversity and in terms of diversity within stands and between stands. And to get back to that disturbance regime, that where if a fire came in, it would not, burn at 40% moderate to high severity, but it would burn more in that low to mixed severity fire regime that has historically been there. And if the project can accomplish all this, which we think, because we're using the best available science and hope that it will, then that should lead back to the purpose of that part of the critical habitat subunit, which was to increase habitat suitability and increase that connectivity over time. And so I don't know if we have time specifically for questions, but also there's some thank yous here.
I just wanted to, she's not here, but give kind of a shout out to our district ranger, because she has been very dedicated at the table, all of our ID team meetings out in the field. She asks every resource specialist, what's your objective for this project? And just having her line support has just been tremendous in the development of this project. And I know it'll be there through implementation and monitoring as well. So, thank you.